The courthouse stood like a sentinel of justice in the center of town, its tall columns and weathered stone giving off an air of permanence. To those who passed by, it looked like any other government building, majestic but ordinary, its walls holding the weight of countless cases over the years. Inside, however, every corner pulsed with a mixture of order and tension. It was a place where lives could change in a matter of minutes, where truths collided with lies, and where the voices of both the powerful and the powerless carried equal weight, at least in theory. That morning began like many others. The janitor had arrived first, pushing a squeaky cart down the echoing hallways, his mop brushing across the marble floors that had seen generations of footsteps. Soon after, clerks filtered in, carrying steaming coffee cups and thick stacks of files tucked under their arms. They spoke in hushed tones, as though the very walls demanded silence until court was officially in session. The air smelled faintly of paper, dust, and the bitter tang of freshly brewed coffee from the vending machine on the first floor. Attorneys trickled through the doors, their arms weighed down with leather briefcases stuffed with documents. Some walked briskly, heads bent, lips moving silently as they rehearsed arguments. Others took their time, adjusting ties or smoothing skirts, giving off an air of control, even if nerves rattled inside. The courthouse had that effect. It was a stage, and every person who entered became part of the performance, whether as actor, spectator, or judge. Court officers stood by the entrance, their uniforms sharp and their faces expressionless. They knew the routine well. Search bags, check IDs, guide people through the metal detectors. They offered polite but firm nods, reminders that while the building was open to the public, it was also governed by unshakable rules. A few joked quietly among themselves about last night's ball game, but their eyes stayed alert. One never knew what kind of drama would unfold inside those chambers. The courtroom itself was a world within a world. Wooden benches lined with smooth, worn seats faced the raised platform where the judge would preside. A long table on each side awaited the attorneys, their surfaces soon to be littered with yellow legal pads, case files, and pens that would click nervously throughout the day. Overhead, fluorescent lights hummed softly, and in the far corner, an American flag stood tall, its colors muted by years of courtroom battles. On most days, the room carried the same rhythm. Defendants shuffled in with downcast eyes. Lawyers presented their cases. Jurors listened with varying degrees of interest, and the judge ruled with a voice that could be either stern or compassionate, depending on the circumstances. To the casual observer, it was predictable, even monotonous. But beneath the surface, every trial carried stakes: freedom, reputation, justice, sometimes even life itself. That morning's docket was packed, and the judge had already settled into chambers, sipping his coffee and reviewing the lineup of cases. He was a man of routine, known for keeping his courtroom orderly and efficient. Though often stern, he had a reputation for fairness, something that earned him the respect of most who entered his domain. To him, today's schedule appeared ordinary enough, another day of balancing law and humanity. But as the morning wore on, and people filled the benches, whispers began to circulate. This case was different, not because of the charges, which were serious but not unprecedented, but because of one unusual witness, a child. And not just any child, a 3-year-old girl, whose testimony could make or break the proceedings. Few had ever seen someone so young called to the stand. It was almost unheard of. Children that age were unpredictable. Some froze up completely. Some babbled nonsense. Others cried for their parents. Their innocence was both their strength and their weakness, and many judges avoided putting them in such a position at all. But this case required it. What the little girl had seen mattered, and there was no way around it. She would have to speak. As word spread, curiosity grew. Attorneys exchanged glances across the aisle, silently acknowledging the challenge ahead. Reporters shifted in their seats, sensing a story that went beyond legal technicalities. Even the jurors, still settling into their roles, felt the weight of expectation. Everyone understood that this was not just another day in court. Something different was about to unfold, something that might stay in their memories long after the verdict was delivered. In the hallway outside the courtroom, families waited anxiously. Some clutched purses or briefcases. Others held one another's hands. The atmosphere was heavy, as if the very air carried the burden of what was at stake. Children's voices, usually so full of life, were absent here. No one wanted to break the solemnity of the moment. The echoes of footsteps rang louder than usual, each sound magnified by tension. Inside, the bailiff adjusted papers on the judge's bench, straightened a few chairs, and glanced toward the heavy oak doors. He had seen countless witnesses walk through them, confident businessmen, nervous teenagers, defiant criminals. But a toddler? That was something new. He tried to imagine how she would even reach the microphone, how her voice would carry across the room. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of uncertainty about the day ahead. Meanwhile, in a small waiting room down the hall, the little girl sat quietly, swinging her legs against a chair too big for her tiny frame. She clutched a stuffed bunny, its fur worn thin from years of comfort. Next to her sat a handler with a large golden canine, the courthouse's therapy dog. The dog lay calmly at her side, his steady breathing a silent promise of safety. The girl reached out occasionally to stroke his fur, her eyes lighting up for brief moments before clouding again with worry. She didn't understand the gravity of the courtroom, but she understood fear, and she understood trust. Her guardian sat nearby, nervously wringing hands, whispering reassurances that everything would be okay. The lawyers had explained, the judge had prepared, but no one truly knew what would happen once she was called to the stand. All they could do was wait and hope. Back in the main courtroom, the chatter began to fade as the clock ticked toward the session's start. Jurors sat straighter, pens poised. Attorneys flipped through their notes, highlighting questions they hoped would land gently enough for a child to answer. The judge's gavel rested quietly, its next strike poised to call the room to order. It was, in many ways, just another morning at the courthouse. But in another sense, it was unlike any morning before. Everyone present could feel it in the air, a strange mixture of dread, curiosity, and hope. Soon the doors would open, and a 3-year-old girl would walk in. And with her would come the possibility of truth spoken in the simplest words, words that could carry more weight than the most polished legal arguments. The courthouse, with all its history, was about to witness something extraordinary. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom creaked open, and in that instant, the restless hum of voices softened into silence. Heads turned instinctively, and all eyes landed on the small figure entering the room. She was tiny, so small that the wooden bench railing seemed taller than her head. Her shoes tapped softly against the polished floor, their sound magnified in the sudden hush. In her arms, she clutched a stuffed bunny, so worn its fur was patchy, and its ears sagged in different directions. The toy was not just a plaything. It was a shield, a companion that had followed her into this intimidating world of adults, suits, and solemn faces. She was 3 years old, and she was the witness everyone had been waiting for. The judge, seated above the room in his elevated chair, adjusted his glasses and peered down at her. He was not known for tenderness. His reputation was one of efficiency and authority, but even he could not help softening his expression as he watched the child. In his decades on the bench, he had seen hardened criminals, victims of unspeakable crimes, liars, truth-tellers, and every shade in between. But never had he presided over testimony from someone so young. A part of him wondered if it was even possible. Could such a small child carry the weight of truth in a courtroom where lives hung in the balance? The prosecutor stood, his tone careful, his gestures deliberate. He knew the jurors were not watching him. They were watching her every movement, every flicker of expression. His role for the moment was not to argue but to guide, to gently coax a frightened voice into being heard. "Good morning," he said softly, as though addressing his own child at home. "Can you tell us your name?" His voice echoed across the room, but the little girl did not answer. Instead, she pressed her bunny closer to her face, her eyes darting nervously toward the benches filled with strangers. The jurors leaned forward in their seats. Some had children or grandchildren of their own, and the sight of such a young witness stirred protective instincts. Others shifted uncomfortably, wondering if this was right, if it was fair to place such a burden on a child barely old enough to form full sentences. The defense attorney, too, studied her closely, though for different reasons. Every pause, every silence, every hesitation might be used to discredit her. And yet, deep down, even the defense knew that if she spoke, her words could carry an innocence impossible to fabricate. At the side of the room, the child's guardian watched with tense anticipation. They wanted to scoop her up, to shield her from the staring eyes and the intimidating walls. But rules kept them seated, forced to trust the process. It was the hardest thing they had ever done. Their knuckles turned white as they gripped the edge of the bench, silently urging her to find her voice. The little girl's legs swung back and forth under the chair. She could barely reach the floor, her small frame swallowed by the large wooden seat. Her gaze flickered between the prosecutor, the judge, and the rows of strangers staring at her. The microphone on the table in front of her loomed large, its cold black metal unfamiliar and scary. It wasn't a toy. It wasn't a friend. It was a demand, an expectation that she wasn't sure she could meet. The silence stretched. The prosecutor tried again, his voice patient, his words simple. "Do you have a favorite toy with you today?" The girl glanced down at her bunny, squeezing it tighter, but still no sound came. Her lips parted slightly, as though a word was forming, but then she closed them again, retreating into silence. A ripple of tension moved across the room. Jurors exchanged uneasy glances. Reporters scribbled notes, sensing the fragility of the moment. The defense attorney tapped a pen against the table, eyes narrowed, already imagining how silence might play in their favor. And yet, beneath the tension, there was something else in the air. Hope. Everyone in that room, judge, jury, attorneys, even spectators, understood that this was more than a procedural step. This was a test of courage. To ask a toddler to speak in such a setting was to demand more bravery than many adults could summon. Her silence was not stubbornness. It was fear. And fear, everyone knew, was the enemy of truth. The bailiff, standing near the bench, shifted slightly, his expression softening. He had grandchildren the same age, children who giggled freely in the safety of home, but clammed up when confronted by strangers. He could see the tremor in her hands, the way her eyes kept drifting to the courtroom door as though searching for escape. She was, in every sense, just a little girl. And yet, she was also the key to the case. The judge cleared his throat gently. He leaned forward, lowering his voice to something almost grandfatherly. "You're safe here," he said, not as a command, but as a reassurance. His words carried a weight different from the attorney's. They were not strategic, not calculated. They were simply human. The girl's head tilted slightly, acknowledging him, though she still did not speak. Minutes ticked by. In a courtroom, silence can feel heavier than words. It pressed against the walls, thick and unrelenting. Every second that passed without an answer deepened the uncertainty. Would she speak? Could she? Or would the burden prove too great for someone so small? Then came a flicker of movement. Her eyes shifted to the side of the stand, where a large golden dog lay stretched out on the floor. The courthouse canine ranger had been assigned to her as a support animal. He had been trained for moments like this, though no amount of training could ever fully prepare him for the unpredictability of children. His head rested on his paws, his eyes half closed, but his presence was steady and calming. The girl's lips curved into the faintest smile as she reached out one small hand, her fingers brushing the air as if inviting him closer. The courtroom held its breath. She still hadn't spoken, but her gesture revealed something vital: trust. She trusted the dog. And perhaps, through him, she might find the strength to trust the room as well. The prosecutor noticed the shift and stepped back slightly, giving her space. He did not press with more questions. Sometimes silence was not failure. Sometimes it was preparation. The jurors seemed to sense it too. They leaned back, their earlier impatience replaced by quiet understanding. The defense attorney, though wary, also fell still. Everyone knew they were standing on the edge of a breakthrough. The girl's hand dropped back to her lap, clutching her bunny once more. She took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling in quick bursts. She didn't speak yet, but the change was visible. She was no longer staring at the floor, no longer lost in fear. She was beginning to lift her head, to meet the eyes of those around her. For the first time since she had entered the courtroom, it seemed possible that she might speak. And that possibility was enough to hold the entire room in rapt attention. The little girl sat perched in the oversized wooden chair, her small body nearly swallowed by the structure around her. The microphone loomed just above her chin, a dark, metallic reminder of the task ahead. To the adults in the room, it was nothing more than equipment. To her, it was strange, foreign, almost frightening. The stuffed bunny clutched in her hand offered some comfort, but it was not enough. Her gaze drifted once more to the golden dog lying at her side, and for the first time since she had entered the courtroom, her shoulders eased ever so slightly. The K9, named Ranger, was no ordinary dog. He was a courthouse therapy animal, trained specifically for moments, like this, moments when fear threatened to silence those most in need of a voice. Ranger had been through years of preparation, learning to remain calm in the face of chaos, to offer silent companionship without distraction. He was large, his coat thick and golden, his eyes steady pools of patience. He did not wag his tail wildly or demand attention. Instead, he exuded stillness, a quiet presence that invited trust. Ranger's handler, seated nearby, watched closely but did not interfere. The bond between the dog and the child was already forming, delicate but unmistakable. Every time the girl glanced his way, the dog shifted just slightly, positioning himself so she could reach him if she wished. When her fingers finally stretched downward, brushing the soft fur between his ears, Ranger lifted his head just enough to acknowledge her touch. No bark, no dramatic movement, just a subtle tilt, a silent agreement. I am here. You are safe. The room noticed. Jurors, who only moments before had been questioning whether such a young child could withstand the courtroom, leaned forward with softened expressions. Some smiled faintly, touched by the sight. The judge, usually a figure of rigid authority, allowed himself a moment to observe the interaction with something akin to hope. Even the attorneys, adversaries locked in legal battle, paused in their strategies to witness the simple exchange. It was a reminder that beneath the layers of law and argument, humanity still lingered. The girl's breathing slowed. Her fingers lingered in Ranger's fur, kneading gently, as though grounding herself in the warmth of his presence. The stuffed bunny, though still pressed against her chest, no longer seemed her only lifeline. She had found another one that was alive, steady, and unshaken by the weight of the courtroom. Ranger, for his part, remained unbothered by the stares, the tension, the silence. His world was simple: protect, comfort, be present. And in fulfilling that role, he became the anchor the child so desperately needed. The prosecutor, recognizing the shift, chose his next words carefully. His tone was calm, his question simple. "Do you like dogs?" he asked, glancing briefly toward Ranger before returning his gaze to the child. The girl's lips trembled, not quite forming words, but her eyes brightened just slightly. She gave the faintest nod, her hand still resting on Ranger's head. It was not a verbal answer, but it was something, a signal, a step forward. The prosecutor did not press further. He let the moment breathe, understanding that progress in such circumstances could not be forced. The defense attorney, though trained to find weaknesses, recognized the significance as well. He knew jurors were not immune to emotion. They were not robots tallying evidence. They were human beings who felt the same stirring of empathy now present in the room. To challenge a child in such a vulnerable state was dangerous, even if it served legal strategy. For the moment, he remained still, his pen resting unused against his notepad. The bailiff shifted his stance, arms folding across his chest. He had seen countless witnesses tremble on that stand, grown men with hardened faces, women who carried years of pain, teenagers caught between defiance and fear. But this was different. This was a child whose courage depended not on adult reassurances, but on the quiet presence of a golden dog. He marveled silently at the simplicity of it. The justice system, with all its procedures and formalities, was relying on something as pure as the bond between a child and an animal. The girl's guardian, seated a few rows back, blinked away tears. They had worried endlessly about this day, about whether the little one would shut down completely under the weight of so many eyes. Yet here she was, fragile but present, her tiny hand resting with trust on the broad head of the dog beside her. It was not victory, not yet, but it was a beginning. And beginnings mattered. Ranger shifted again, this time leaning his body closer so that his side pressed gently against the girl's legs. The movement drew a tiny giggle from her, a sound so unexpected in the somber courtroom that several jurors smiled involuntarily. It was a soft, fleeting sound, but it carried power. For the first time, the child was not lost in fear. She was connected, engaged, even if only for a moment. And that was enough to change the atmosphere entirely. The judge cleared his throat softly, a subtle reminder that the proceedings must continue. Yet even he hesitated to break the fragile thread of progress. He had seen enough trials to know that sometimes justice required patience. To rush this child would be to risk silence forever. Instead, he gestured gently to the prosecutor, signaling him to continue with the same care he had shown. The prosecutor leaned forward slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "What's your bunny's name?" he asked, nodding toward the stuffed toy clutched in her hand. The girl's gaze flickered downward. For a long moment, it seemed she might retreat into silence again. But then, almost imperceptibly, she whispered, "Bunny." The word was small, fragile, nearly lost in the cavernous room. Yet it carried like thunder. Every ear caught it, every heart felt it. It was not just a name, it was proof. Proof that she could speak, that she could find her voice if given the right space. The prosecutor smiled softly, careful not to overwhelm her with praise. Instead, he glanced toward Ranger, as if acknowledging the dog's silent role in the breakthrough. The jurors exchanged glances, their expressions softening even further. They had just witnessed something extraordinary, the unlocking of a child's voice through the comfort of an animal who asked nothing in return. For the girl, the act of speaking that single word felt monumental. She squeezed her bunny tighter, then rested her other hand more firmly against Ranger's fur. He responded by closing his eyes, settling back into his patient stillness. To her, it felt like approval, like encouragement to keep going. She was not alone. She had an ally, not in the form of a lawyer or a judge, but in the form of a dog who asked for nothing but her trust. The moment stretched, delicate yet profound. The courtroom, so often a place of tension and conflict, had been transformed into something quieter, almost sacred. It was not the law that had created this shift, nor the arguments of attorneys. It was the bond between a child and a dog, a reminder that sometimes the simplest forms of comfort carried the greatest power. And as the proceedings continued, it became clear to everyone in that room. Without Ranger, there might have been no testimony at all. The courtroom, though filled with people, felt hushed, as though everyone were collectively holding their breath. The little girl sat on the witness chair, her stuffed bunny pressed tightly against her chest, and Ranger's golden fur brushing her fingertips. She was small, fragile, yet the entire weight of the proceedings seemed to rest on her shoulders. Even the judge, a man seasoned by decades of rulings, leaned forward with a softened expression, aware of the precariousness of the moment. The prosecutor rose slowly, careful not to startle her. His papers remained on the desk. This was not the time for formal notes or rehearsed arguments. This was a test of patience, compassion, and trust. He stepped forward, his voice steady but gentle. "Sweetheart, can you tell me your name?" It was the simplest of questions, one even toddlers were expected to answer. But in the cavernous courtroom, under the scrutiny of strangers, the question loomed like a mountain. The little girl's lips trembled. Her eyes darted toward the jury box, where 12 pairs of eyes watched silently, and then toward the defense table, where a stern-looking attorney tapped a pen against his notes. She quickly dropped her gaze to the bunny, hugging it tighter. Her voice did not come. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. Jurors shifted in their seats. A reporter scribbled something quickly into his notepad. The defense attorney smirked ever so slightly, though he tried to mask it with neutrality. Every second of quiet seemed to confirm his suspicion. She was too young, too overwhelmed, too unreliable to serve as a credible witness. The prosecutor didn't press. He had studied the psychology of children in courtrooms, knew that demanding answers often drove them deeper into fear. Instead, he offered another gentle question, something familiar, something safe. "What's your bunny's name?" For a long moment, it seemed she might remain silent again. But then, in a voice so faint it was almost a whisper, she breathed, "Bunny." The room reacted almost imperceptibly, an exhale of relief, a shift in energy. The jurors leaned in, eager now, while the judge allowed the faintest flicker of a smile. It wasn't much, but it was proof. Proof that her voice existed, that she could speak here if given the right conditions. Encouraged, the prosecutor nodded softly. "Bunny is a good name," he said, as though sharing a secret. Then, carefully, he shifted again. "And do you like dogs?" His eyes flicked briefly to Ranger, who lay obediently at the girl's feet, his warm body pressed lightly against her legs. The girl's gaze lifted toward the dog. For the first time since she had taken the stand, she allowed herself a small, tentative smile. She gave a quick nod, her fingers tangling in Ranger's fur. The prosecutor paused, giving space for the reaction. He could sense that pushing too quickly might undo everything. The girl's guardians seated in the gallery clasped their hands together in silent encouragement, mouthing words she could not hear. "You're doing so well." But the next question was harder, and everyone knew it. At some point, they had to move beyond toys and pets, into the truth that had brought her here. The prosecutor hesitated, choosing his words with surgical precision. "Do you remember why you're here today?" he asked softly. The girl froze. Her shoulders tensed, and her grip on Bunny tightened until her knuckles turned white. Her lips parted as though to speak, but no sound came. Her eyes filled with uncertainty, darting once more toward the defense attorney, whose expression was unreadable but intimidating in its stillness. She looked back at the prosecutor, then down at her bunny, burying her face against its fur. The courtroom felt the shift immediately. The fragile progress began to unravel, replaced again by fear. Jurors exchanged anxious glances. The prosecutor felt his throat tighten, his heart sinking. To ask her to recall what she had seen, to relive it in this environment, might be too much. She was not refusing, she was drowning in fear. The judge cleared his throat, not harshly, but with the weight of authority. "Take your time, young lady," he said in a tone softer than most had ever heard him use. "You're safe here. No one will hurt you." His words hung in the air, and though they offered comfort, they were not enough. The girl remained still, her face buried in Bunny's fur, silent once again. And then Ranger moved. The golden dog, sensing her distress, shifted closer, pressing his side firmly against her legs. He lifted his head, resting it gently on her lap. The girl blinked down at him through tearful eyes, her tiny hand instinctively moving to rest on his head. His steady warmth radiated up through her palm, grounding her. She sniffled softly, her shoulders trembling, but she did not retreat further. The room seemed to recognize the turning point. Jurors leaned in again, visibly softened. The prosecutor let the silence linger, resisting the urge to fill it. He understood that this was no ordinary witness examination. It was a battle between fear and trust, silence and truth, and the dog had become her greatest ally. Finally, the girl lifted her face from Bunny. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes glistening, but her gaze was steadier. She looked at Ranger, then at the prosecutor. Her lips parted once more. "Good dog," she whispered. The words were not an answer to his question, not the testimony they needed. But they were something else, an opening, a bridge across her fear. The courtroom, once again, reacted with awe. It was such a simple phrase, 2 words spoken by a child, yet they carried the weight of progress. The defense attorney's smirk faltered. He scribbled furiously on his notepad, but even he could not ignore the power of the moment. The jury had witnessed courage, however small, and it mattered. The prosecutor smiled gently, nodding. "Yes, Ranger is a very good dog," he agreed. His voice carried no pressure, only affirmation. "And you are very brave." The girl blinked at him, her hand never leaving Ranger's head. For the first time, she did not look away. The hesitant beginnings were fragile, delicate, but undeniable. The silence had cracked, and through the crack, truth was beginning to emerge. The courtroom exhaled as one. They all understood. She wasn't ready yet, but she was closer. The beginnings were hesitant, yes, but beginnings nonetheless. And everyone in that room knew that sometimes the smallest voices carried the greatest weight. The courtroom was heavy with silence. It was the kind of silence that pressed against the chest, thick and suffocating, stretching each second into an eternity. All eyes remained fixed on the little girl seated in the oversized wooden chair, her bunny clutched tightly in one hand, her other hand buried in Ranger's fur. She had spoken only a few words, fragile and fleeting, but they had been enough to hold the room captive. Still, the unspoken question hung in the air. Would she go further? Would she say what needed to be said? The prosecutor's heart pounded beneath his calm exterior. He had handled difficult witnesses before, adults hardened by trauma, teenagers simmering with defiance, but nothing compared to this. With a child so young, every approach felt like walking a tightrope. Push too hard, and she would retreat into silence. Wait too long, and the fragile connection might dissolve. For now, he simply stood back, leaving her space. He could feel the jurors' impatience, the defense attorney's sharpened gaze, but he resisted. Sometimes patience was the only strategy. The little girl's chest rose and fell quickly, her breaths shallow. Her wide eyes scanned the room again, the jury box, the prosecutor, the defense attorney, and then darted toward the towering figure of the judge. She shrank back slightly, overwhelmed by the solemn faces and unfamiliar setting. But then her gaze fell to the floor beside her, to the steady presence of Ranger. The golden dog had not moved much since settling by her side, but his calmness radiated like sunlight. He shifted slightly now, exhaling a long, slow breath. His body language relaxed and unbothered by the tension thick in the room. The girl's small hand slid from his head to his neck, fingers tangling gently in his fur. It was then that something shifted in her expression. Her brows unfurrowed, her lips softened, and for the first time since entering the courtroom, she looked less like a frightened child and more like a child simply being. Then suddenly, she lifted her hand. At first, the gesture was small, hesitant, uncertain. She raised her arm slowly, as though testing whether it was allowed. The movement drew immediate attention. The jurors straightened. A prosecutor leaned in. Even the judge paused mid-note, his pen hovering above the paper. All eyes followed the small hand as it stretched outward, her finger pointing across the room. Gasps rippled through the benches. People whispered, their voices too low to be distinct, but urgent nonetheless. The defense attorney's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing as he tried to anticipate what the gesture meant. The prosecutor's pulse quickened. This was it, the breakthrough, or the breaking point. But the girl wasn't pointing at the prosecutor. She wasn't pointing at the defense attorney, or the jury, or the judge. She was pointing at Ranger. The golden dog, sensing the movement, lifted his head and tilted it slightly, ears perking. His amber eyes locked on hers, calm and patient, waiting for her to act. The little girl's finger trembled, but it remained steady in its direction. She wasn't afraid of the dog. She wasn't confused. She was choosing him. A hush swept over the room, deeper than before. Even the faint hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to fade as everyone leaned into the moment. The girl's lips parted. For a heartbeat, nothing came. Then, in a voice so soft it barely carried across the courtroom, she spoke. "Good dog," 2 words. That was all. 2 words, simple and childlike, but they fell into the silence like stones dropped into a still pond. Their ripples spread instantly across the prosecutor, the jurors, the spectators, even the judge. The prosecutor's throat tightened. Relief, awe, and gratitude washed through him all at once. The jurors leaned forward, their pens forgotten, their eyes wide. A woman in the back row covered her mouth with her hand. The judge, seasoned though he was, allowed himself a visible reaction, a brief smile that flickered before he regained composure. The defense attorney froze, his pen hovering uselessly above the page. He had expected hesitation, silence, maybe even tears. But this sudden, decisive gesture, followed by words filled with innocent certainty, shifted the energy of the entire room. For the girl, the words carried more weight than anyone could measure. They were not testimony in the legal sense, not a recounting of events or a direct accusation, but they were proof of something crucial: trust. By pointing to Ranger and speaking aloud, she had crossed a threshold. She had shown she could speak in this room, that her voice could find its way past fear. And once the first words came, more might follow. Ranger lowered his head back onto her lap, his eyes still fixed on hers. The girl's lips curved upward into the faintest smile, her small hand patting his head as if rewarding him. The words she had spoken were meant for him, but their impact belonged to everyone. The judge leaned slightly forward, his deep voice breaking the silence. "That's right," he said warmly, addressing the girl directly. "He is a good dog." His tone was gentle, almost grandfatherly, far removed from the stern authority he usually displayed. The words, though simple, validated hers, reinforcing the fragile courage she had shown. The prosecutor seized the moment with care. "You're very brave," he said softly, not as a lawyer, but as a human being. He didn't rush to ask another question. He let the room breathe, let her courage settle like seeds in fertile ground. In the gallery, her guardian pressed trembling hands to their mouth, tears brimming in their eyes. They had feared she might never speak at all. Yet here she was, pointing to her protector and declaring him good. It was a small miracle, and they knew it. The jurors exchanged glances, silently acknowledging the power of what they had witnessed. It was not evidence in the traditional sense, but it was truth in another form, the truth of a child's heart, untainted by the complexities of adult agendas. The defense attorney scribbled hastily in his notes, though the gesture felt futile. He could not erase what had just happened. 2 words from a child had shifted the trial in ways no legal argument ever could. The little girl, unaware of the magnitude of her gesture, simply stroked Ranger's fur. Her breathing slowed, her posture straightened slightly. The courtroom was no longer an ocean of strangers. She had anchored herself in the dog at her side, and through him, in the courage to keep speaking. The moment lingered, delicate but unbreakable. It had begun with a sudden gesture, a small hand raised, a finger pointed. It ended with 2 words that left the room speechless. And everyone knew this was only the beginning. The stillness in the courtroom after the little girl's sudden gesture was unlike anything most had ever experienced. It wasn't the silence of boredom or routine proceedings, nor the silence that followed a gavel strike. It was something alive, fragile, heavy, expectant. The kind of silence that carried more weight than sound ever could. Her 2 words, "good dog," still lingered in the air, echoing in the minds of everyone present. The jurors, transfixed, had leaned forward in unison, as if pulled by invisible strings. The spectators sat rigid in the benches, hardly daring to breathe. Even the court clerk, who had spent years recording every dry word spoken in that room, had paused mid-typing, caught in the glow of a moment that felt historic. For the prosecutor, those words were more than just a breakthrough. They were a lifeline. He could almost feel the entire case pivoting on the fragile syllables that had left the child's lips. They weren't direct testimony yet. They weren't the damning details he needed. But they were proof. She had a voice in this room, and she had chosen to use it. And for someone so young, so scared, choosing to speak at all was an act of astonishing courage. The judge, who had sat in that very chair for decades, leaned slightly forward, his expression softened. His robe and gavel gave him authority, but it was his tone that revealed the true depth of his wisdom. "Those are very important words," he said gently, addressing the girl. "You did very well saying them." The girl's small shoulders relaxed at the affirmation. She patted Ranger's head, her tiny fingers sinking into his golden fur. For her, speaking had not been about evidence or law. It had been about safety, trust, and the comforting presence of the dog who anchored her against the tidal wave of fear. She whispered the words again, almost to herself this time. "Good dog." The second time was even more powerful. It wasn't whispered into nothingness. It was deliberate, clear enough for the jury to hear without straining. Gasps rippled through the benches once again. The guardians sitting in the gallery clasped their hands together, tears running silently down their cheeks. They knew the child's world better than anyone, and they understood what it meant for her Pete herself, unprompted. The prosecutor hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to push forward, but his experience warning him to tread carefully. He decided to take the risk, not with a heavy question, but with an open one. "Sweetheart," he said softly, "can you tell us why Ranger is a good dog?" The courtroom held its breath, all eyes fixed on the girl. She blinked at him, her gaze flickering briefly toward the defense attorney before darting back to Ranger. Her lips pressed together, her throat bobbed, and then slowly, haltingly, she whispered, He makes me safe." The words struck like lightning. Simple, honest, direct. A murmur swept through the courtroom, hushed voices trading astonishment before falling quiet again. The jurors' pens scratched furiously across notepads, recording every syllable. The prosecutor felt his chest tighten, a mixture of relief and awe. Those 4 words, "He makes me safe," were not just about Ranger. They were about everything. Safety had been stolen from her, and now, in front of strangers, she was reclaiming it. The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably, his pen tapping harder against the desk. He was not rattled easily, but he could sense the ground slipping beneath him. A jury was not swayed only by facts and law. They were swayed by truth, by humanity, by moments like this. And in this moment, the child's innocence spoke louder than any legal argument could. The prosecutor gave her a small nod, his voice soft. "That's right," he said. "Ranger is here to keep you safe." He didn't press further. He didn't need to. She had crossed another threshold, moving from a description of Ranger to a description of her own feelings. Each word was another brick in the bridge between silence and testimony. The judge cleared his throat, breaking the reverent quiet. "Let the record reflect," he said carefully, "that the witness stated, 'He makes me safe.'" His pen tapped gently against his notes before he set it down, his expression unreadable but deeply moved. The girl clutched her bunny tighter, but her posture was different now. She wasn't curled inward, retreating into herself. She was sitting straighter, anchored by the dog at her side and emboldened by the gentle responses of those around her. For the first time since stepping into the room, she looked less like a frightened witness and more like a child beginning to reclaim her voice. Ranger shifted slightly, as though aware of his success. He rested his chin on the edge of the witness stand, his big amber eyes gazing up at her. She giggled softly, so softly that it nearly broke the hearts of everyone listening. The sound was fleeting, but it was real, and it was hers. The guardian in the gallery let out a shaky exhale, their hands trembling. They had feared this day would crush her, that the weight of the courtroom would silence her completely. Instead, they were witnessing something else: resilience, courage, the first steps toward healing. The defense attorney rose suddenly. "Objection," he said sharply, his voice slicing through the fragile warmth that had filled the room. Leading the witness. Counsel is clearly guiding her toward responses that suit the prosecution's narrative. The judge raised a hand, silencing the room. He regarded the defense attorney with a stern look. "Objection overruled," he said firmly. The child's words were her own, and they will remain on record. The defense attorney sank back into his seat, masking frustration behind a stony expression. But the damage was done. The jury had heard the words. They had seen the gesture. They had felt the moment. No objection could erase it. The prosecutor resisted the urge to press further. He knew better than to chase the moment. Instead, he gave a small bow of his head and said, "Thank you, sweetheart. You've done very well." The girl smiled faintly, her eyes still on Ranger. She had not told the full story, yet not even close. But she had spoken. She had declared something true, something real, something no one in that room would ever forget. Her 2 words, "good dog," had opened the door. Her next 4, "he makes me safe," had begun to build the path forward. And in that moment, the entire courtroom understood. The voice of a child, once freed, could carry a truth strong enough to shake walls, silence arguments, and leave grown men speechless. For a long, breathless moment, no one in the courtroom moved. The little girl's words, fragile, halting, yet devastatingly powerful, hung in the air, refusing to dissipate. "He makes me safe." It was not just a description of a dog. It was a revelation, a glimpse into the inner world of a child who had been forced to carry a burden far too heavy for her small shoulders. The silence that followed was unlike any other. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't uncertain. It was reverent, as though the entire room had collectively realized they were witnessing something sacred. The jurors were the first to show the impact. A woman in the front row blinked back tears, her pen lying forgotten on the notepad in front of her. Beside her, a middle-aged man who had sat stone-faced for most of the trial leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, as though steadying himself against the weight of what he had just heard. One by one, the members of the jury glanced at each other, exchanging unspoken acknowledgments. This child was not fabricating, not parroting lines fed to her. She was speaking her truth. In the gallery, the spectators, many of whom had come out of curiosity more than civic duty, shifted in their seats. Their whispers were hushed but urgent, like murmurs in a church pew after a powerful sermon. A woman pressed a tissue to her mouth, stifling a sob. A man in the back row muttered softly to his neighbor, "That poor kid." The emotional tide that swept the benches was undeniable, impossible to resist. The guardians seated behind the prosecutor lowered their head into their hands. Their body trembled as silent tears spilled through their fingers. They had sat through countless meetings, interviews, and sleepless nights worrying whether the child would ever find her voice. Now, in this solemn chamber, she had found it. Not through coercion, not through fear, but through the quiet presence of a dog who asked nothing of her but trust. Even the judge, who had spent decades cultivating a mask of impartiality, betrayed the faintest crack in his composure. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and blinked a little faster than usual. He had presided over murder trials, fraud cases, and bitter custody battles. He thought he had seen everything. But this was different. He was not just an arbiter of law in this moment. He was a witness to courage. The prosecutor remained still, his hands resting lightly on the podium. He dared not break the spell too quickly. He allowed the child's words to settle, to echo, to carve themselves into the hearts of everyone present. In his years of practice, he had learned that some moments in courtrooms were not about argument or persuasion. They were about silence that allowed truth to breathe. The defense attorney, however, bristled against the silence. His pen tapped furiously against his notes, his jaw clenched tight. He knew better than anyone that emotion could sway a jury more powerfully than logic. Facts mattered, of course. Evidence mattered. But jurors were human beings before they were arbiters of law. And human beings responded to the rawness of a child's words in ways no cross-examination could undo. He stood abruptly. "Your Honor," he said, his voice sharper than intended. "The witness's comments are anecdotal at best. This is not relevant testimony to the facts of the case." I moved to strike it from the record. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The prosecutor's head turned slowly toward him, his expression controlled but incredulous. The jurors stiffened, their eyes narrowing in collective disapproval. The idea of erasing the child's words, stripping them from the record as though they had never been spoken, was not just a legal maneuver. It was an insult. The judge's gavel struck once, the sharp sound breaking the tension. "Motion denied," he said firmly, his voice carrying a rare edge. "The witness's words will remain on record. The jury will give them the weight they deem appropriate." The defense attorney sank back into his chair, his face flushed. He scribbled furiously in his notebook, though it was clear the outburst had cost him. Jurors were not blind. They had seen the attempt to silence the child, and they did not forget. Meanwhile, the girl herself seemed unaware of the storm she had caused. She stroked Ranger's fur, her small hand moving rhythmically, her breathing slow and steady. For her, the courtroom's reaction did not exist. There was only the dog, the anchor, the friend who made her safe. Ranger, ever calm, pressed his head further into her lap, his golden eyes soft and steady. He didn't understand the legal battle unfolding around him, but he understood the child's heartbeat, the trembling that had eased, the courage that had bloomed. He had done his job, not with words or evidence, but with presence. The prosecutor finally broke the silence, his voice low and measured. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, "you have just heard the truest words you may ever hear in this courtroom." He did not embellish. He did not grandstand. He simply let the moment speak for itself. A murmur of agreement rippled through the spectators, quickly hushed by the bailiff's stern glance. But the energy in the room had shifted permanently. Where once there had been skepticism about the girl's age, her reliability, her ability to testify, there was now conviction. Not conviction in the legal sense, not yet, but conviction of belief. They believed her. The guardian lifted their head, their face streaked with tears, but radiant with pride. They had seen the girl's courage in small, private moments, when she dared to sleep without the light on, when she whispered her fears during nightmares. But to see that courage bloom here, in this daunting chamber filled with strangers, was nothing short of miraculous. The jurors scribbled notes, but their pens could not capture the gravity of what had unfolded. How did one reduce to ink the power of innocence? The way 2 words could silence a room, the way a child's voice could pierce through cynicism like sunlight through storm clouds? The defense attorney shifted again, trying to mask his unease. He had built his case on doubt, on painting the child as too young, too fragile, too unreliable. But now, doubt had shifted sides. It no longer clung to the child. It clung to him. The judge leaned back, his expression returning to solemn neutrality. Yet inside, he knew he would never forget the sound of that small voice declaring safety in a place where safety had been stolen. The courtroom reacted not with applause or cheers, but with something far more enduring. Belief. Belief in a child. Belief in truth. Belief that even the smallest voice, once heard, could change the course of justice. And as the girl continued to stroke Ranger's fur, her bunny nestled in her lap, the room seemed to exhale together. The trial was far from over. More questions would be asked, more objections raised, more evidence presented. But everyone knew they had just witnessed the moment the tide began to turn. The words of a child, 2 words at first, then 4 more, had cut through fear, through formality, through the armor of doubt. And no matter what came next, the courtroom would never be the same. Long after the gavel struck to end the day's proceedings, the echoes of the little girl's words still lingered within the courtroom walls. Courtrooms were built for order, for evidence, for arguments between adults who wielded language like weapons. But that day had been different. That day, the voice of a child, soft, halting, but unshakably honest, had carried more weight than any statute or precedent. The jurors filed out slowly, their faces solemn. Many clutched their notepads, but barely glanced at them. The notes, full of legal terms and fragmented observations, felt inadequate compared to what they had just witnessed. It wasn't the ink that stayed with them. It was the sound of a small voice declaring, "He makes me safe." For some, that voice replayed like a hymn, reminding them of the responsibility they bore. For others, it gnawed at them with a quiet insistence. Justice here was not just about law, it was about humanity. In the gallery, the spectators trickled out with unusual silence. Courtrooms often ended with chatter, with speculation about the strength of arguments or predictions about verdicts. Not today. Today, people left with tear-streaked faces and heavy hearts, whispering to one another about the courage they had witnessed. Strangers held doors for each other, their gestures softer, gentler, as though the child's bravery had reminded them of something easily forgotten: compassion. The prosecutor sat for a long while at his desk, papers spread before him but untouched. He stared at the polished wood, his mind replaying every moment of the child's testimony. He had built his career on preparation outlines, strategies, carefully crafted questions. Yet all his preparation had paled next to the two simplest words in the English language, "good dog." Those words, unprompted and pure, had done more to sway a jury than any closing argument ever could. He leaned back in his chair, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. For once, he didn't feel like the architect of justice. He felt like its witness. Across the aisle, the defense attorney remained rigid in his seat, his jaw tight, his pen still tapping against the legal pad. He was no stranger to loss or setbacks, but this felt different. He had expected to dismantle the child's testimony, to expose her as too young, too malleable, too unreliable. But how did one dismantle innocence? How did one argue against the unshakable truth of a child pointing to her protector and declaring him good? His legal strategies suddenly felt hollow, like weapons made of paper. For the first time in years, doubt crept in not about the case, but about himself. The judge retired to his chambers, his robe hanging heavy on his shoulders. He sank into the leather chair behind his desk and removed his glasses, rubbing at tired eyes. Judges were trained to remain impartial, to anchor themselves in law rather than emotion. Yet even he could not deny the shift he had felt. The child's words had cut through the layers of procedure, through the cold armor of formality. He knew he would carry them with him long after the verdict was rendered. In his career, he had written thousands of opinions. But this case, this moment, would become one of the stories he told long after he laid down the gavel for good. And the little girl? She left the courtroom with her guardian, Ranger trotting faithfully beside her, his golden coat gleaming in the late afternoon light. She clutched Bunny in one hand and held the leash with the other, her small steps quickening as the heavy courthouse doors swung open. Outside, the world was loud again, traffic, voices, footsteps echoing on pavement, but she no longer flinched. Ranger was there. Bunny was there. She had spoken, and she had survived it. Her guardian knelt in front of her on the courthouse steps, tears glistening but a smile breaking through. "You are so brave," they whispered, cupping her face in trembling hands. The little girl nodded solemnly, as though she understood the weight of what she had done, even if she couldn't yet name it. She leaned down, wrapping her arms around Ranger's neck, burying her face in his fur. "Good dog," she murmured again, the words now soft with affection rather than fear. For Ranger, the trial was already forgotten. He didn't know of verdicts or legal records. He only knew the scent of the child's hair, the warmth of her embrace, the steady rhythm of her heartbeat against his chest. He had done his job simply by being there, by lending his presence when words had failed her. To him, that was enough. Days turned to weeks, and the trial continued, filled with testimony, objections, and evidence. Yet everyone who had been there that day carried the child's words with them. Jurors remembered them when deliberating late into the night. Reporters recalled them when writing their articles, their headlines softened by the humanity of the moment. Even those who had only heard about it secondhand spoke of it as though they had been present. The phrase "good dog" took on a meaning larger than itself. It became shorthand for courage, innocence, and the fragile strength of truth. When the verdict finally came, it was unanimous. Justice was served, not because of the most eloquent legal arguments, but because of a child's willingness to trust, to speak, to be heard. The little girl's voice had tipped the scales, and the weight of her words had proven impossible to ignore. But the impact of that day stretched far beyond the trial. Laws began to shift, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum. Across the country, more courts opened their doors to therapy animals, recognizing the profound difference they could make for vulnerable witnesses. Judges cited the case in conferences and discussions, using it as proof that justice was not weakened by compassion, it was strengthened by it. For the girl, the lasting impact was quieter, more personal. She began to speak more freely at home, her laughter returning in small bursts like sunlight through clouds. Nightmares still came, but less often, and always with Ranger curled at her feet to guard her dreams. In school, she learned to raise her hand, her voice soft but steady, and her teachers marveled at her resilience. Her guardian watched with pride, knowing that the journey was far from over, but grateful for the milestones along the way. Each time the child whispered, "Good dog," it wasn't just a phrase. It was a reminder that she had faced her fears and found her strength. Years later, long after the trial had faded into history, those who had been there still remembered. A juror told the story to her grandchildren, her voice trembling as she recalled the courage of the smallest witness she had ever seen. A prosecutor recounted it to new attorneys, reminding them that the law was not just about evidence, it was about people. And somewhere, in a quiet home, a young girl, no longer small, stroked the ears of an aging golden dog and smiled. The world had turned. Time had passed, but the truth of that day remained. 2 words, simple, childlike, eternal. Good dog.